I remember the exact moment the floor dropped out from under my life. It wasn't during a screaming match or a dramatic confrontation in a rain-slicked driveway. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind of golden suburban Saturday that looks like a commercial for insurance or expensive lawnmowers. I was standing by the grill flipping burgers, listening to the chaotic, beautiful sounds of my 3 kids splashing in the inflatable pool. Claire was laughing, handing a cold beer to our neighbor Nolan, who was leaning against the fence with that easy, effortless charm he always seemed to carry. Then my cousin Brooks leaned in, his voice low and raspy from years of working in the shop, and said something that changed everything. "Man, Owen, it's crazy, isn't it? If I didn't know better, I'd swear Nolan's genetics were just stronger than yours. Look at Toby's ears, man. That little hole right above the lobe. Nolan's got the exact same thing. And those eyes, that weird gold fleck in the iris, it's like looking at a carbon copy." I laughed it off. I had to. I told him he'd had too many IPAs and to get his eyes checked. But as soon as the words left my mouth, a cold, sharp needle of ice pierced my chest. I looked at Toby, my 3-year-old, my miracle baby. Then I looked at Mia, my 6-year-old princess, and Leo, my 9-year-old world changer. I looked back at Nolan, and for the first time in 10 years, I didn't see my neighbor. I saw a mirror. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something. Have you ever had a gut feeling so violent it made you physically sick, but you buried it because you loved someone too much to believe they were capable of destroying you? Have you ever felt like a stranger in your own home? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I honestly feel like I'm drowning right now, and knowing there are people out there who have survived this might be the only thing keeping me upright. If you've ever been through a betrayal that redefined your entire reality, please hit that subscribe button. We're in this together. My name is Owen. I'm a landscape contractor. I spend my days moving earth-building walls and creating beautiful spaces for families to grow in. I've always been a fixer. If something is broken, I find a way to make it solid again. I spent a decade thinking I was building a legacy. I worked 80-hour weeks in the Ohio humidity, my skin burning and my back aching cool so Claire could have the dream house with the wraparound porch and the kids could go to the best private schools. I was proud of that. I was proud of her. Claire was the it girl in our town, elegant kind, the kind of mother who never had a hair out of place. We were the couple people looked at when they wanted to believe in marriage. But as the sun began to set that Saturday, the perfect picture started to blur. I found myself staring at Nolan's ears. It sounds insane, right? Staring at a man's ears. But there, it was a tiny pin-sized hole called a preauricular sinus. It's a rare genetic trait. I don't have it. My parents don't have it. Claire doesn't have it. But Nolan does. And as Toby ran up to me to grab a juice box, I knelt down and saw it. Clear as day. A tiny, perfect hole right above his ear. Then I looked at Mia's eyes as she squinted in the sun. That gold fleck. The exact same heterochromia that Nolan joked about being his superpower. The air felt thin. I felt like I was breathing through a straw. I watched Claire walk over to the fence to take a tray from Nolan. Their fingers brushed for a second too long. It wasn't a grab, it was a linger. And the look she gave him, it wasn't the look of a friendly neighbor. It was a look of shared history. It was a look of ownership. In that moment, the house I built, the life I labored for, and the children I tucked in every night felt like a stage set. I was the only person in the audience who didn't know the play was a lie. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in our California king bed, listening to Claire's rhythmic, peaceful breathing. How could she sleep so soundly? I felt like my skin was crawling. I kept thinking about the timeline. Leo was born 9 years ago during a summer when I was working a massive commercial project 3 towns over. I was barely home. Nolan had moved in 6 months before that. Then Mia. Then Toby. Every time we had a rough patch, Claire would suggest we try for another baby to bring us closer. I thought it was love. Now I realized it was insurance. The next few days were a blur of agonizing observation. I became a detective in my own living room. I noticed how Nolan's wife, Vanessa, a sweet 4th-grade teacher, would wave at us, with so much genuine affection completely oblivious. I noticed how the kids would gravitate toward Nolan when he was out working on his car. I noticed the way Claire's phone was always face down. Always. I'm a simple man. I'm not into mind games. But I knew I couldn't just ask her. If I was wrong, I'd destroy the best thing in my life. If I was right, well, I wasn't ready for what right meant. I went to the hardware store, but I didn't buy mulch or lumber. I went to a pharmacy 2 towns over where nobody knew me. I stood in the aisle for 20 minutes, staring at the shelf. DNA paternity test. Results in 3 to 5 days. 99.9% accurate. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought I'd faint. I bought 3 of them. The cashier gave me a look, part pity, part curiosity. I wanted to tell her it wasn't what it looked like, but I couldn't speak. I drove back home and parked in the garage, the engine clicking as it cooled. I sat there in the dark for a long time. The garage smelled like oil sawdust and old dreams. I looked at the 3 boxes sitting on the passenger seat. These weren't just cardboard boxes. They were grenades. If I opened them, if I used them, there was no going back. I thought about Leo's soccer game next week. I thought about Mia's dance recital. I thought about the way Toby calls me Dada when he wakes up from a nightmare. If the results came back the way I feared, who was I? Was I still their father? Was I a man who had been a father to 3 strangers for a decade? I heard the door from the kitchen open. Claire stepped into the garage, her silhouette framed by the warm light of the house. She looked beautiful in her silk robe, her hair cascading over her shoulders. "Owen, honey, what are you doing out here?" "It's late," she said, her voice dripping with that practiced, honeyed concern that I used to find so comforting. I shoved the boxes under a pile of my dirty work hoodies on the seat, my movements jerky and panicked. My heart was racing, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. I turned to look at her, trying to force a smile, but my face felt like stone. She walked closer, her eyes searching mine, and for a split second, I wondered if she could see the betrayal already written on my soul. I felt like a criminal, even though I was the one being robbed. "Just checking the inventory for tomorrow's job," I lied, my voice cracking. "I'll be in a minute." She lingered for a second, her hand resting on the car door just inches from where the kits were hidden. She tilted her head, a small, knowing smirk playing on her lips, the kind of look she gave when she thought she was 3 steps ahead of me. "Don't work too hard, Owen. You know we need you." She blew me a kiss and retreated back into the house, closing the door softly. I waited until I heard the click of the lock. Then, with trembling hands, I reached under the hoodies and pulled out the first box. I gripped the plastic seal, my fingernails digging into the packaging until the skin turned white, my breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps as I stared at the clinical, heartless instructions for the DNA swabs. The plastic crinkled under my fingernails like a death rattle in that dark, oil-stained garage. My breath was coming out in ragged, uneven bursts, fogging up the interior of the truck as I stared down at the cotton swabs that felt heavier than a sledgehammer. I knew that once those tips touched the inside of my children's cheeks, the man I used to be, the happy provider, the gullible husband, would be buried forever. But I couldn't stop. The seed of doubt had already grown into a forest of thorns, and the only way out was through. I waited until the glowing red numbers on the dashboard hit 3 a.m. The house was silent, a hollow shell of brick and siding that held 10 years of my labor and 3 children, who might not even carry my name. I stepped out of the truck, my work boots feeling like lead weights on the gravel. I moved through the mudroom with the precision of a ghost, dodging the squeaky floorboard near the pantry that I'd been meaning to fix for months. It was ironic. I spent my life fixing things for other people, yet I was standing in a home that was fundamentally broken at the foundation. I started with Leo, my eldest. My mini-me, or so everyone said. I stood over his bed, watching the moonlight hit his face. He looked so peaceful, so innocent. My hand shook so violently, I had to grip my wrist with my other hand to steady it. As the swab swirled against his inner cheek, I felt a wave of nausea so intense, I had to close my eyes. I wasn't just collecting DNA. I was dismantling a decade of bedtime stories and Saturday morning baseball games. One by one, I moved through the rooms. Mia with her strawberry-scented hair, and little Toby, who gripped my pinky finger in his sleep, just as I withdrew the swab. That tiny, trusting squeeze nearly sent me to my knees. I retreated to my office, sealed the envelopes with clinical trembling hands, and hid them deep inside an old landscaping manual. I didn't use their names on the labels. I used subject A, B, and C. I had to turn them into data points just to survive the night. The next morning, the sun rose with a cruel, mocking brightness. I sat at the breakfast table, my eyes burning from lack of sleep, watching Claire move through the kitchen with the practiced grace of a woman who had mastered the art of the lie. She was humming a melody, a soft, catchy tune. It took me a moment to realize it was the same song Nolan had been blasting from his garage speakers 2 days ago. The realization felt like a physical blow to my throat. She poured me a cup of coffee, her hand brushing mine, and for the first time in our marriage, her touch made my skin crawl. "You're awfully quiet this morning, Owen," she said, leaning against the counter, her eyes searching mine with that perfect wife concern. "Big project on your mind?" "Just a lot of moving parts." "Claire," I replied, my voice sounding like it was coming from a different room. "A lot of things I need to get exactly right. I left for work early, but I didn't head to the job site. I drove 2 towns over to a post office where no one would recognize me. As I handed the package to the clerk for overnight processing, I felt a strange, hollow lightness. The fuse was lit. There was no going back to the man who didn't know. The next few days were a slow-motion car crash. I lived in a state of hyper-awareness. I noticed how Claire's phone was always face down on the granite island. I noticed how she'd suddenly volunteer to take the scraps over to Nolan's chickens just as I was getting home from work. I noticed the leakages in our joint savings account, small $50 or $100 withdrawals that added up to thousands over the year. She wasn't just cheating on me. She was subsidizing Nolan's life with my sweat and blood. I became a stranger in my own skin. I went through the motions, tucking the kids in, eating her dinners, nodding at her stories about the PTA. But my mind was a war room. I started recording everything. I checked phone logs and found deleted messages that weren't really gone. I found a hidden folder on our shared cloud drive that was protected by a password I'd never seen. When I finally cracked it using Toby's birthday, the ultimate insult, I found photos. Not just of them, but of us. Photos where Nolan was in the background of our family vacations, always there, always lingering like a parasite. The email notification finally hit my phone on a Tuesday afternoon. I was standing in a half-dug trench at a job site, the Ohio heat humid and suffocating. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a long, sustained vibration that signaled an attachment. I climbed out of the dirt, my heart hammering against my ribs, and sat in the cab of my truck. I opened the PDF from the clinical genomics laboratory. I didn't read the intro. I scrolled straight to the bottom. Probability of paternity 0.00%. I scrolled to the second page. 0.00%. The third. 0.00%. The world outside the truck window went silent. The sound of the backhoe, the shouting of my crew, the wind in the trees, it all vanished into a dull white roar. I wasn't a father. I was a host for a biological takeover. A decade of 80-hour weeks of backbreaking labor, of missed sleep and sacrificed dreams. It had all been for another man's legacy. Every time Claire told me she loved me, she was laughing at me. Every time she told the kids to be like Daddy, she was mocking my very existence. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my phone. A cold, crystalline rage settled over me, the kind of rage that doesn't burn out. It just hardens into steel. I sat there for an hour staring at the 0.00% over and over again until the numbers burned into my retinas. I realized then that I wasn't just a victim. I was a man who had been given the ultimate weapon, the truth. I called Sarah a divorce attorney, known in our county as the Shark. She'd handled a messy split for one of my high-end clients, and I remembered her saying, in this state, the one who moves first with the most evidence wins the war. "Sarah, it's Owen," I said, my voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "I have the results. It's a clean sweep, all three." There was a pause on the other end, a rare moment of silence from a woman who was never at a loss for words. "Owen, I'm so sorry. I've seen this before, but never three. What do you want to do?" "I want a forensic accountant," I said, my grip tightening on the steering wheel until the leather groaned. "I want every cent she funneled to him tracked. I want her to think she's winning for a few more weeks. I want her to feel as safe as I felt before last Saturday. And then, I want to take the floor out from under her." "You want a quiet filing?" she asked. "No," I replied, looking at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I didn't recognize the man staring back. "I want a reckoning. But we play it my way. I'm going to stay in that house. I'm going to kiss her hello. I'm going to be the perfect husband while I strip her world down to the studs." I drove home that evening with a terrifying clarity. I pulled into the driveway and saw Nolan out front washing his car. He waved at me that same easy neighborly wave. I waved back a slow, deliberate motion. I looked at his ears. I looked at the gold flecks in his eyes. He knew. He had to know. He was living the life of a father without the responsibility while I was the mule carrying the load. I walked into the kitchen, and the smell of roasting chicken hit me a perfect family dinner. Claire was standing at the stove, her back to me. She looked so small, so fragile. It was hard to believe such a delicate frame could hold so much malice. "Hey, stranger," she said, turning around with a bright, rehearsed smile. "You're late. I was starting to think the trench swallowed you whole." "Just finishing up the foundation," I said, my voice steady. I walked over to her and did something that made every nerve in my body scream. I leaned in and kissed her cheek. I felt her pulse under my lips, steady and calm. She wasn't even nervous. She was a pro. I sat at the table and watched the children eat. Leo was talking about his science project. Mia was showing me a drawing. Toby was throwing peas at the dog. I looked at them and felt a chasm opening in my chest. I still loved them. How could I not? I'd raised them. But every time they laughed, I heard Nolan's voice. Every time they blinked, I saw his eyes. They were the living, breathing evidence of my humiliation. "Is everything okay, Owen?" Claire asked, her fork hovering halfway to her mouth. "You're staring at Leo like you've never seen him before." "Just thinking about how much they've grown." I lied, my smile never reaching my eyes. It's amazing how fast things can change, isn't it? One day, you think you have everything figured out, and the next, you realize you were looking at the wrong map. She laughed, a light tinkling sound that made me want to howl. "You're getting philosophical in your old age, babe. Maybe you need a vacation." "Maybe." I said, taking a sip of the wine she'd poured. It tasted like vinegar. Actually, I was thinking we should host a big dinner. Next weekend. Invite Nolan and Vanessa. Celebrate the end of the big project. What do you think? Her eyes lit up. The trap was so beautiful she didn't even see the edges of it. I think that's a wonderful idea. I'll call Vanessa tomorrow. I watched her take a sip of her wine, her throat moving as she swallowed, completely unaware that she had just agreed to her own public execution. I spent the rest of the night in my office, supposedly catching up on billing, but actually meeting with Brooks in the shadows of the backyard. Brooks was waiting for me by the tool shed, a dark silhouette against the fence. He just handed me a small black device. It's high-def Owen, motion activated. I'll help you tuck them into the eaves of the porch and the garage. If they so much as whisper near that fence, you'll have it in 4K. Thanks, Brooks, I whispered. You're sure about this? He asked. Once you see it, once you hear it, there's no unhearing it. I've already heard enough, I said, looking up at the master bedroom window where the light was still on. I'm not the man who hides anymore. I'm the man who watches. We spent the next 2 hours in the dark, moving like commandos through my own property. I installed cameras in the places I knew they met. By the time we were done, my house was a digital cage. I went back inside and found Claire asleep. I lay down on the edge of the bed, as far away from her as I could get without falling off. I didn't sleep. I watched the live feed on my phone, the grainy infrared images of my backyard flickering in the palm of my hand. I waited for the sun to come up, my eyes fixed on the empty space where Nolan usually stood, my heart turning into a cold, hard knot of anticipation as I planned the next move in a game she didn't even know we were playing. The infrared glow from my phone screen was the only light in the room, casting a ghostly greenish hue over the ceiling as I lay perfectly still next to the woman I no longer knew. Watching the live feed felt like spying on a stranger's life, even though the backyard on the screen was the one I had mowed and manicured for a decade. Every snap of a twig outside or the distant hum of a passing car made my pulse spike, but I forced my breathing to stay slow and rhythmic. I had to be a ghost. I had to be the silent observer of my own destruction. When the sun finally began to bleed through the curtains, I didn't feel tired. The adrenaline of the betrayal had replaced the need for sleep with a cold, vibrating energy. I slipped out of bed before the alarm went off, my movements fluid and quiet. I stood in the kitchen staring at the empty wine glasses from the night before. Claire had sipped hers with such casual elegance, toast after toast, to a future she had already sold to the man next door. I washed the glasses slowly, the soap bubbles sliding over the crystal like the slick lies she fed me daily. "You're up early." Claire's voice drifted in from the hallway. She was rubbing her eyes, her hair messy, in that way I used to find adorable. Now she just looked like a predator waking up for a hunt. Couldn't sleep, thinking about the menu for the dinner party. I said, not turning around. I kept my back to her, so she couldn't see the fire in my eyes. I want it to be perfect, something Nolan and Vanessa will never forget. "You're so thoughtful, Owen," she whispered, wrapping her arms around my waist from behind. I felt a wave of revulsion so strong, it was a miracle I didn't pull away. "They really appreciate everything you do for the neighborhood." Everything I do. The irony was a jagged blade in my gut. I spent the day at the office not working on landscaping designs, but meeting with the forensic accountant Sarah had recommended. His name was Miller, a man who looked like he'd spent his entire life in windowless rooms, counting other people's sins. He laid out a stack of bank statements that looked like a roadmap of Claire's infidelity. "It's not just the cash withdrawals, Mr. Miller," he said, tapping a pen against a spreadsheet. "She's been paying a mortgage on a small condo downtown for 3 years. It's not in her name, but the payments come directly from your business overhead account. She disguised them as equipment leases. A condo, I whispered. The air in the room felt like it had been sucked out. And there's more. She's been listed as a silent partner in a small construction consultancy that Nolan started last year. You've been funding his business, Owen. You've been paying for the very tools he uses to be who he is. I walked out of that office feeling like I was made of glass. I wasn't just a father to children who weren't mine. I was the primary financier for the man who had stolen my life. I drove to the hardware store and bought the most expensive high-quality projector they had in stock. I told myself it was for a special presentation at the dinner party. In a way, it was. The days leading up to the dinner were a blur of calculated kindness. I bought Claire flowers. I took the kids to the park and watched them play with a heart that felt like it had been put through a wood chipper. I looked at Leo, Mia, and Toby and tried to find a single trace of myself in their faces. There was nothing. Just Nolan's jaw, Nolan's eyes, Nolan's smirk. I realized then that my love for them was a habit I was desperately trying to break. The night of the dinner arrived with a heavy, humid tension in the air. I had set up the long table on the back deck right near the fence line. I'd strung up fairy lights and polished the silverware until it gleamed like a warning. Vanessa and Nolan arrived at 7 p.m. Vanessa looked lovely, carrying a bottle of expensive bourbon and a tray of appetizers. Nolan followed behind her dressed in a crisp linen shirt, looking every bit the successful, relaxed neighbor. "Owen, this looks incredible, man," Nolan said, clapping me on the shoulder. I felt the weight of his hand and imagined breaking every bone in it. "You really went all out." "Only the best for family." I said the word family, tasting like poison. We sat down and the wine began to flow. Claire was in her element, laughing at Nolan's jokes, her eyes darting to him with a frequency that made my skin itch. Vanessa sat across from me, talking about her fourth-grade students, her voice full of a sincerity that made me pity her. She was the second victim in this play, and tonight I was the one who was going to pull the curtain back. "So, Owen," Nolan leaned back, swirling his wine. "Brooks mentioned you were doing some investigative work on the side. Something about a big project." Claire's hand stilled on her glass. She looked at me, a flicker of genuine fear crossing her face for a microsecond. "Actually, yeah," I said, standing up. I felt a strange, calm power coursing through me. "I've been working on a legacy project. It's about the history of this neighborhood, the things we inherit, the things that are passed down through blood." I walked over to the projector I'd set up on the side of the house. The white siding was the perfect canvas. "I thought I'd show you some photos I've been collecting," I continued. "Family history is a funny thing. You think you know where you come from, but sometimes the truth is hidden in the details, like the way a child smiles, or a tiny rare mark on an ear." I hit the remote. The first image wasn't a photo. It was a high-definition close-up from the infrared camera I'd installed behind the shed. It showed Claire and Nolan clear as day, locked in an embrace that left no room for interpretation. The timestamp was from 3 nights ago. The silence that hit the table was absolute. Vanessa dropped her fork, the metal clattering against the china like a gunshot. "Owen," Claire whispered, her voice cracking. "Wait, I'm not done," I said, my voice as cold as a winter grave. "That's just the prologue." I clicked the remote again, the screen filled with the PDF results of the DNA tests. I'd highlighted the names in bright, bold red. Leo 0.00%, probability of paternity. Mia 0.00%, probability of paternity. Toby 0.00%, probability of paternity. Nolan stood up his chair, screeching, "Owen, what the hell is this? This isn't funny." "Funny." I turned to look at him, and for the first time I let the rage show. "You think it's funny that I've spent 10 years breaking my back to pay for your children? You think it's funny that my wife used my business account to pay for your condo and your consultancy? Vanessa turned to Nolan, her eyes wide with horror. Nolan, what is he talking about? A condo? I clicked the remote a third time. Now the screen showed the bank statements Miller had found. The leases, the silent partnerships, the leakages from our savings. It was a paper trail of a decade of theft and biological fraud. Claire stood up, her eyes darting around like a trapped animal. Oh, and think about the kids you're going to destroy them? The kids. I laughed, a sound that felt like it was tearing my throat open. Which kids? Claire, your kids. Nolan's kids. Because they sure as hell aren't mine. I walked to the edge of the deck. I've already filed the paperwork, Claire. The forensic audit is with the DA. The house is being listed tomorrow. And Nolan, I've already sent a copy of these files to your girlfriend's parents, the ones who fund your lifestyle. Nolan lunged at me, but Brooks stepped out from the shadows blocking his path. I think it's time for you to go home, Nolan, Brooks said. Nolan turned and ran, leaving Vanessa sobbing at the table. Claire was hyperventilating. You can't do this, Owen. I'll fight you. I'll take everything. You already took everything, Claire, I said, walking toward the back door. There's nothing left to take but the debt. I walked into the house and closed the sliding glass door, locking it with a final heavy click. I stood in the dark kitchen, listening to Claire screaming my name, and the distant sirens of a world I had just burned to the ground, my hands finally, for the first time in weeks, completely still. The silence inside the house was heavy, a thick, suffocating blanket that pressed against my eardrums as the sliding glass door clicked shut, severing the connection between me and the wreckage on the deck. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass, watching Claire through the reflection. She was a frantic blur of motion, her expensive silk dress catching the artificial glow of the projector as she clawed at the air, screaming words I could no longer hear. Across the fence, Nolan's house was a hive of panicked lights. I watched his silhouette pass a window clutching a suitcase. The predator turned prey, fleeing a forest fire of his own making. I moved through the darkened kitchen, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors I had installed with my own hands 3 summers ago. Every corner of this house held a memory that was now a poisoned barb. The growth chart on the pantry door, where I'd marked Leo's height. The dent in the baseboard where Toby had crashed his wooden train. I used to see these things as milestones of a life well lived. Now they were just scars on a crime scene. Owen, open this door. You can't do this to us. Claire's voice finally pierced through the glass, thin and desperate. I didn't open it. I walked to the front door, grabbed my keys from the marble island, and stepped out into the humid Ohio night. I needed air that didn't smell like her perfume, or the copper tang of betrayal. I got into my truck and drove. I didn't have a destination. I just needed the hum of the engine to drown out the internal roar of 10 years of wasted devotion. As I drove past the local park, I saw a father swinging his daughter in the moonlight. I had to pull over. I gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned my knuckles white and bloodless. I thought about the kids, Leo, Mia, Toby. The law said they weren't mine. The DNA said they weren't mine. But my heart was a traitor. It still remembered the weight of them in my arms. It remembered the way Toby's breath smelled like milk when he fell asleep on my chest. How do you unlove a child? How do you delete a decade of being, Dada? I realized then that Claire hadn't just stolen my money or my pride. She had stolen my capacity to trust the very concept of family. She had turned my greatest joy into my greatest source of shame. I pulled out my phone and saw a dozen missed calls from her and one from Brooks. I called Brooks back. She's gone, Owen. Brooks said, his voice unusually soft. She packed a bag and took the kids to her mother's. Vanessa kicked Nolan out too. The whole street is talking. You did it, man. You blew the lid off the whole thing. I don't feel like I won Brooks, I whispered, staring at the empty swings in the park. You didn't win a game, Owen. You survived an ambush. Now you have to decide who you're going to be on the other side of it. The weeks that followed were a cold, mechanical blur of legal filings and forensic audits. Sarah, my attorney, was a surgical strike in human form. She moved through Claire's defenses like a hot knife through butter. Since the DNA tests proved the children were not biologically mine, and since Ohio law allowed for paternity fraud claims in certain circumstances, the financial landscape shifted dramatically. The forensic accountant Miller found that Claire had diverted nearly $240,000 over 6 years. It wasn't just leakages. It was a systematic siphoning of my business's future. We went to mediation in a sterile office building downtown. Claire sat across from me looking haggard. Her perfect facade finally shattered. I did it for them. Owen, she hissed, her eyes darting to the lawyers. Nolan couldn't provide. I wanted them to have the life you could give them. I loved you in my own way. You didn't love me, Claire. I said, my voice devoid of emotion. You used me as a utility company. You saw a hard-working man and decided he was the perfect battery to power your secret life. You let me build my entire identity on a foundation you knew was hollow. The settlement was brutal. Because of the evidence of financial fraud and the biological deception, the court-ordered restitution was significant. The house was sold, and the proceeds went into a trust that she couldn't touch. But the hardest part wasn't the money. It was the goodbye. A month after the dinner party, I met the kids at a neutral park to say my final farewell. Leo walked up to me first. "Are you still our dad?" he asked, his voice trembling. I knelt down and looked at him. "Leo," I said, my throat tight. "I've been your dad every day for 9 years. Nothing changes that in the past. But I can't be the man in the house anymore." I hugged them all one last time. I had to walk away while they were still looking at me. I got into my truck and drove away, watching them get smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror until they were just dots on the horizon. I cried then. I wasn't crying for Claire. I was crying for the version of me that believed in forever. 6 months later, I was standing on a new job site. It wasn't a suburban backyard. It was a massive community garden project for a local nonprofit. Brooks walked over, handing me a cold water bottle. "You heard the news Claire tried to sue Nolan for child support. The judge laughed her out of court because Nolan has 0 assets and no job. She's working 2 jobs now. The perfect life is officially over." I nodded, but I didn't feel the surge of joy I thought I would. The revenge had been served cold and precise, but it didn't fill the hole in my chest. Only time and purpose could do that. I turned back to the garden. I was building a stone wall, one heavy rock at a time. It was slow, back-breaking work, but it was honest. There were no hidden layers, no false foundations, just stone and earth. If there's one lesson I've learned from this nightmare, it's this. The truth doesn't just set you free, it strips you bare. It takes away the comfortable lies and leaves you standing in the cold. But in that cold, you find out what you're actually made of. You find out that you are more than a provider or a husband. You are a person worthy of a love that doesn't require a DNA test. Don't ignore your gut. Don't bury the small things because you're afraid of the big answers. The truth might destroy the life you have, but it's the only way to build the life you deserve. I'm Owen. I'm a builder. And for the first time in my life, I'm building something for myself. I picked up my trowel and smoothed a layer of mortar over the top of the wall. I looked at my hands. They were scarred, calloused, and dirty. But for the first time in a decade, they were clean. I took a deep breath of the evening air, adjusted my cap, and reached for the next stone, ready to finish the day on my own terms. Thank you for watching Secret Affair Stories. If this story moved, you please hit the like button, subscribe for more real-life narratives, and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to start over from scratch? Let's talk about it below.